Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
With the recent dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents around the world, tracking these numbers and using them for action points has become more important than ever. We will discuss this with Yoni Michanie, the research and data manager of the Combat Antisemitism movement that is based in Boston, Massachusetts. Yoni was born in Argentina, served as a paratrooper in the Israeli Defense Force, and graduated in political science, diplomacy, and international security. Yoni, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yoni, what is the Combat Antisemitism movement, or CAM? What is it doing, and what impact does it have?
Sure. So the Combat Antisemitism movement tries to combat anti-Semitism at multiple levels, and it does so principally with two different strategies. The first one is building a grassroots audience and community that takes a vested interest in combating this form of hatred, not just because it impacts them directly, perhaps as Jews, but also non-Jews as well, who understand anti-Semitism as a pernicious sentiment that corrupts societies, and as such would like to repudiate it in any way possible. But we also work with policymakers, principally at the city level and municipal level. So every year, for example, CAM will host its annual mayor summit. We usually host them in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America. And the idea really is to bring lower and medium level policymakers that can have a really tremendous impact on their respective communities, right? Oftentimes there's this big disconnect between the White House and the American public, right? And so we try to bring that to the ground further by trying to basically understand that most Americans actually interact with the local government on a much more frequent basis. And oftentimes they're far more impacted by policies emerging out of these bodies than they are from the executive branch of the United States. And so really by bringing these policymakers together, we can discover innovative ways to combat anti-Semitism. We can explore what has been done in one district and what hasn't been done in another. We can compare rates of success. And more importantly, we can try to continue to formulate plans that allow for more policy-guided and policy-oriented measures to combat anti-Semitism.
Is this not what the AIDL is also doing? Isn't it the same?
To an extent, I would say that a major difference between us and the AIDL, and the AIDL, of course, does tremendously important work, is that we operate at a far more global level. So the AIDL retains a particular focus on the United States, whereas we focus much more on understanding anti-Semitism at a global phenomenon, and trying to work with partners on both sides of the Atlantic and in Latin America too, in order to formulate the most effective policies to combat anti-Semitism.
Well, yes. For instance, I'm from Amsterdam originally. There was the opening of the Holocaust Museum, National Holocaust Museum there 2 weeks ago, and it became quite an anti-Semitic scene there, right at the doorstep of the Holocaust Museum. And the mayor said it was freedom of speech. So what could she have learned from Cam?
So this
Ready
is a
my mouth.
challenge. No, it's a good question. And it's definitely tough to address, but I definitely want to give it my best shot here.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. There's a fundamental challenge in terms of the political philosophy guiding states in the European Union and the United States. Uh, the United States was founded on and predicated on moving away from tyrannical measures that would be found in Europe during the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And freedom of speech was really a fundamental pillar of that political philosophy, and it's prevalent till today, right? So the United States, you can have absolute freedom of speech. I believe the only exception that the Supreme Court has ruled on is that freedom of speech is blanket, exists for all, with the exception of individuals calling for immediate violence. Now, note the word immediate, it's very important because you can call for violence, and that would be protected under freedom of speech. But when you're calling for immediate violence, that's when it would create room for it to be pushed back against in a legislative manner. In Europe, we're dealing with a far different reality. Okay, this is a continent that has been traumatized by 2 world wars, that has been um, plagued by its own history in terms of systematic persecution, not only against Jews, but as well as other ethnic and racial minorities. And so when we issue policy making recommendations, we have to be very cognitive of the fact that we are talking about two different political realities. In Europe, I would say, and ironically, perhaps, that Germany has taken some of the most significant and impactful policies to combat anti-Semitism. We can, of course, debate whether Germany has drawn the line in the sand far too deeply, or whether it hasn't enough. But Germany, I believe, is one of the few, if not only country in the world that has made denial of the Holocaust a crime, right? And so I don't know that outside of Germany,
It is. It's a
uh,
crime. It's a crime in the EU,
in
as
the
far as I
EU,
know. As far as I know,
right?
yes.
So if that is so, and we could find legislation that could point to that, then of course we would try to sit down with policymakers at the city, provincial, or municipal level and try to come up with you know, policies that would be reflective of the overall political climate. Now, I'm sure you know, though, that the Netherlands right now is guided by a government that's not necessarily very aligned by some of the social values that the EU endorses. And so the EU, specifically now, I would say post October 7th, is dealing with a very complex reality that in some ways is awakening the far right in a lot of countries, um, in France, the Netherlands, Italy. And so this is a consequence of the virulent anti-Semitism, I think, that we've seen so openly post October 7th in the streets of Europe.
Well, yeah, the new there is no right, let's call it right wing government yet in the Netherlands. It's still the old government in place. But and what was it wasn't coming from the far right at that Holocaust museum. It also was not a Holocaust denial. It was solidarity with Hamas and scolding Jews with rants that usually come from the Muslim immigrant population.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch on that a little bit because what you're saying is absolutely true, and it reflects a point of convergence between what we would have typically associated with the far right, right? Which has been notorious for minimizing, trivializing, and even denying the Holocaust in and of itself. But we've seen very similar attitudes now coming from the far left. And the protesting of Holocaust museums is not only something that has happened in the Netherlands. We've seen it happen in the UK. We've seen it happen in California. We've seen it happen in New York. I believe we even saw it happen in South Florida as of a few months ago. And there's a reason why. And that reason really, again, reflects the point of convergence between the far right and the far left in the realm of anti-Semitism, which is this obsessive pathological need to view Jews as oppressors, right? To view Jews as only able to inflict harm on their surrounding. I was listening the other day to an interview with really the eloquent Douglas Murray, who, for anyone who's been following his commentary post October 7th, has been so precise and accurate in terms of dispelling a lot of the myths and allegations that we've seen leveled against Israel. And so during that interview, they ask him why the term genocide is being invoked so frequently and why we see the protesting of Holocaust museums. And I thought his answer was simple and to the point. The idea is to hurt Jews where it hurts the most, right? As a collective, the Holocaust is perhaps the memory that binds us all together in one way or another. We all share it. We all feel it as a collective trauma. It's very embedded in our identity. It guides and informs our worldview and the kind of future that we would like to see for our own people. And the idea that it's legitimate to take Israel's actions in Gaza and in the most horrific, insidious, nefarious way draw parallels between um, legitimate self-defense following the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust to the actions committed by the Nazis is unconscionable, right? But it's the strategy that seems to be growing among far left groups, both in Europe and in the US.
And even in Jewish far left groups. That puzzles me enormously. But I don't know if you can comment on that. But
yeah, I will say we've always it's important to preface by the fact that every community has its fringe. Every community does.
It's true.
With whatever socioeconomic political issues that community in and of itself may have faced or is facing, there's always going to be fringe quote unquote thinkers that will be offering a solution that is counterintuitive to the core interests of that particular community. And I think the same can be said about the Jewish community. And oftentimes that becomes very difficult for us to see as fringe because social media makes it as if it's the only reality, that we have around us. And it's important to note that every poll that has come out post October 7th is noting that the vast majority of Jews not only sympathize but agree with the manner in which Israel is conducting the war in Gaza.
I'd like to just add something I heard today. Avi Hyman gave the briefing from the Israel Prime Minister's office today, and I thought he said something very interesting. He said that when historians and others look back at the recent operation Al Shifra Hospital, the largest in Gaza, in terms of a surgical strike to reach the terrorists, but not the civilians, he literally said that it will be studied at West Point, which is the American military academy, in Sandhurst, which is the British, for generations as an example of conducting urban warfare in a very crowded environment with really caring about the civilians. And I thought that was an important message that I don't think enough people will know about.
Mm.
Of course, and I just want to touch base on this because the the application of the term genocide to describe actions carried out by Israel is not the first attempt to grab an internationally recognized crime against humanity, an attempt to distort, shift, or change its definition to make it singularly applicable to the world's only Jewish state. Okay. It is not the first time it's happened. The United Nations, in and of itself, from 1975 to 1991, for 16 years, endorsed the idea and the value that Zionism, the Jewish people's right to self-determination in their indigenous homeland, was a form of racism. Okay. And so what we're seeing in Israel is truly astounding when compared to not only urban warfare, but every other type of warfare there is. Israel has achieved record low numbers in terms of civilian to combatant casualties, far lower than those that the United Nations holds as a standard for conducting legitimate military operations in urban settings. And so the idea here is to take a step back and try with genuine intent using the actual definition of genocide to see if it applies. And what we find is that not only does it not apply, but in fact, Israel is responding to an attempted genocide that failed on October 7th, right? I mean, what other genocide in history involves the supposed culprit opening up humanitarian corridors for civilians to go through and defending those corridors as well, because we know very well the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad was using those opportunities to fire at their own people, labeling them deserters, very much akin to what the Germans were doing in the weeks before Berlin fell. Okay. In what other genocide in history do we see the quote unquote culprit investing immense number of resources to warn civilian populations about impending strikes? Oftentimes, even sacrificing the prospects of success in that given military operation. What
Can I
kind
just
of
say, wait, I'm
yeah.
just going to say, I want to be Elon Levy, which I recently saw doing an interview, and say, Yoni's talking about Israel for anyone who might not be understanding.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. That's certainly important. Um, and it brings us back to the fact that Israel is responding to a genocidal attempt by Hamas and Palestinian collaborators on October 7th, who went door to door in over 20 kibbutzim and murdered children in front of their families in front of their children, and who still hold over 130 Israeli hostages. Now, what people need to understand is that one of the reasons why the negotiations for the hostage release has not succeeded is because Hamas is unable to even produce a list of the hostages that remain alive. Okay, that is how little consideration these barbarians have given to Israeli citizens before, during, and post October 7th.
Can I just add one thing here? I listened to the briefing Monday through Thursday out of Israel, and they always give the amount of food that's brought into Gaza. And I wish they would end each of that review by saying, and is any of this food reaching the hostages? I feel that Israel's not always using its information tools enough. To keep talking about the Gazians, do we talk about whether the hostages are being fed? I think it's really important. I just wanted to add it there because I don't think we do that enough.
You're absolutely right, and it wouldn't be unfair to assume that they don't. I mean, after all, we have vast evidence that the Red Cross retained for weeks critical medicine that needed to go to the hostages and simply was not being delivered.
Yoni, you just said there are less civilian casualties in Gaza than one usually sees in urban warfare elsewhere. Where can we find numbers that you think are reliable?
So that's a good question, and I can make sure to share those after the call. But principally, I think we can rely on the world's foremost leader in terms of studying urban warfare, John Spencer, who has spent a considerable amount of time not only in conversations with Israeli officials, but also on the ground. He's seen the tunnels, he's seen the manner in which Israel will enter target infrastructure, such as the Al-Shifa hospital. But even more so, I mean, we're talking about operations that come to light every single day. They are just not given sufficient attention by the media. So, for example, the Al-Shifa hospital didn't involve just one battle between the IDF and Hamas since October 7th. It's involved two. In fact, as Israel was further planning its incursion into Rafah, or Rafah, where the last Hamas battalions remain, there was a group of Palestinian fighters that were able to make their way back into central Gaza, and again take hold of this hospital. And Israel's operation there virtually left almost no civilians dead. We're talking about 200 terrorists that were killed, another 500 that were imprisoned. I mean, that is remarkable, um, remarkable military tactics. It's something that the US, in its involvement and in leading Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS, was unable to achieve in Mosul. And it is, of course, far less than the civilian casualties that were inflicted on Iraq and Afghanistan post 9/11.
So now I'm asking for the source because in the as Jews all over the world, we are attacked with the argument and blamed for genocide in Gaza. And so we need to know the exact or the reliable numbers. So you refer us to John Spencer. Where is John Spencer located?
I don't know where he's located. I know he spent considerable time in Israel post October 7th.
Is he a professor or is he American? Is he Israeli? Is he
No,
who is John
he's
Spencer?
he's definitely American, and he writes for the Modern War Institute.
Mm.
And so, for example, early January, he put out an article called Gaza's Underground, Hamas' entire political military strategy rests on its tunnels. And so, there he really dives into how Hamas has weaponized these tunnels, which have mostly been built by foreign aid since Israel's disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And it's noteworthy of highlighting the fact that since Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005, the Gaza Strip has received more aid than all of Europe received post World War II in terms of what was needed for reconstruction. And just to answer your question about John Spencer himself, he's a founding member of the International Working Group on Subterranean Warfare. And he's the co-author of Understanding Urban Warfare, which is a key piece of literature for policymakers and military officials, particularly in democratic liberalized states who are interested in innovating means of engaging in both moral but effective war when needed in highly urbanized settings.
His URL is and then I'll spell his name, johnspenceronline.com. And John is John, and Spencer is Spencer online.com.
Great.
So,
Thank you. So you published a report about the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the world and in specific regions in 2023. How do you monitor those incidents?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Up until last year, which I believe, if the number is right, we monitored 3,046 incidents of anti-Semitism around the world. Obviously, we noticed a huge spike of over 300% in the last quarter of 2023. Which of course can be attributed to the horrific events of October 7th.
How do you
We
monitor? How do you
we
monitor?
s-
Do
so
you
we
read it in the newspaper, or you?
yes, we have a criteria, of course, for how we categorize an incident as an incident. These criteria usually involve some sort of visual, right, that allows us to see whether it was an incident of vandalism, or a video if it requires assessing whether it was hateful speech or conduct. And so once these sort of basic necessary conditions are met, we can categorize an incident as an incident, and then from there we try to assess what the manifestation of the incident was. Okay. Now,
So Yoni, if if there is a Star of David graffitied at my front door and that doesn't make it to the newspaper or the news,
sure. Yeah,
would
and
you
by
monitor?
no
Would you know about it?
No, we wouldn't know about it. And that of course speaks to the limitations of doing work like this. Now, I'll talk about briefly what the limitations are, but I also want to emphasize that the fact that limitations exist don't preclude the need to engage in this type of work, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. So the first limitation, of course, is that we still have a lot of members within our own community that can't recognize anti-Semitism right away. They can understand that something that was said or something that was done impacts their core identity to some extent, but they can't articulate it in a way where they can pinpoint to it and say, ah, that's anti-Semitism. So that's one limitation. And by the way, that's a limitation that research centers trying to monitor incidents of racism, Islamophobia, of every other form of hatred out there deal with, right? I mean, we don't always have the capacity to determine what's anti-Semitic and what isn't. The second is the fact that individuals, a lot of the times, will not report an incident of anti-Semitism. I've
yes.
certainly been in positions in my life where I experienced it on such a frequent basis that I internalized it as a reality. And whether that reality was shared with some research center halfway across the world trying to monitor incidents, to me, that was inconsequential, right? And so a lot of the times we know that we're just grasping at the tip of the iceberg because incidents are either not being reported or they're not being recognized. Those are the main two limitations that I deal with. Now, why is our work so important despite those limitations? Is that if we hadn't done this work, we wouldn't have been able to recognize 3,050 incidents of anti-Semitism, but we did. And by examining those incidents, seeing how they look like, the type of motivation that drove the perpetrator to commit that incident, the type of responses that that incident instigated, and the manner in which the incident itself was carried out, we learned a tremendous amount from how anti-Semitism looked like at that period in time.
And then
So,
what?
and then we do our best to translate these findings into effective policymaking recommendations, right? And so one of so I can tell you that pre-October 7th, particularly in the United States, the major concern in terms of the security and safety of the Jewish community was far more directed at the far right. There was an understanding that the far left existed, but that it was principally limited to rhetoric and not action. But the far right, specifically neo-Nazi groups, presented far more physical threats to the Jewish community, and they were far more imminent than those that came from the far left. But October 7th changed that reality entirely. And we were able to understand that by the monitoring of our incidents.
So, like we already hear for years that Jews are harassed on campuses. So I'm wondering what are the what incidents are you counting? Where do you get your data from? Is it what's in the news? Do you get it from newspapers? Do you get it from social media? Do you get it from ADL's recorded
Yeah,
incidents?
so
Where do you find what are you
that's a good
counting
question.
exactly? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. As of a couple months ago, we joined in partnership with a technology company that developed a particular software tool for us that allows us to assess not only thousands of websites at the same time, but also multiple social media platforms.
Mhm.
So let's take a step back to the small incident of anti-Semitism that you had mentioned in your question a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
If you're walking down the street and your Magen David necklace is ripped out of your necklace or out of your neck, that's a small story. Okay, it likely won't be picked up in a newspaper, and you likely won't take time out of your busy day to contact a news reporter and make sure that that news is told exactly as it was. And so I will probably have more luck going onto Twitter or TikTok or some sort of social media
Yeah.
where your respective community resides and where you likely would have chosen to tell the sequence of events that happened that day.
Mhm.
And so we're finding oftentimes that incidents of anti-Semitism are being reported on social media platforms by individuals who experienced them or who witnessed them
Mhm.
because because at this point, news outlets are merely seen as the middleman, right?
Yeah.
I can communicate with audiences directly. I don't need to go to a news reporter.
Right.
But only having access to this technology, which we gained about 2 months ago, are we able to assess at such large scales. And since we've began using this technology, our recording of incidents has at least doubled.
I see. Interesting how you approach this way, a way to count incidents. So that also makes it extra important for all of us to somewhere put our experiences with anti-Semitism to put them out somewhere, whether it is calling the ADL or writing the ADL or writing about it online, so that somebody will find out about it, somebody who is counting the incidents and analyzing them. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, tell your story, but for 3 reasons. Okay. And I promise you that research is the least important of all of them. Number one, oftentimes making public the experience that we underwent allows us to develop the tools to deal with that experience, however great or important or minimal it must have been. But letting our community know that this virulent form of hatred is still out there is important, specifically for ourselves. Next, it's for the community, right? Oftentimes, you don't know which individual in your community may have undergone a very similar experience to the one you went. And even more so, we underestimate the power of what sharing our story could do for individuals who have unfortunately experienced similar incidents in it of themselves. It can be very uplifting, it can be very powerful, and it can make us feel less lonely. And I don't know about you, but as a Jew, specifically post October 7th, loneliness has been, or the feeling of loneliness has been one of the most prevalent feelings that I've had to contend with.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then lastly, of course,
Absolutely.
yes, the research. Yes, absolutely. We need to know what is happening. Whether we have policymakers that want to wrestle with the truth or not. But the best we can do is show them the information and show them the reality.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we're only able to see the large scale, we're only able to assess the landscape when all of these reports and all of these data points are compiled and you say, wow, so that's the reality that we're living in.
Yeah.
I think it's very important, and Evelyn and I talk about this in our program a lot, to understand that the information of anti-Semitic incidents needs to be shared, regardless of whether you expect a response from the police. So I won't go through something that was said to me in the neighborhood of someone who didn't report to the police all the flyers. He just picked them off his neighbor's lawn so they wouldn't see it. And when I asked him, why didn't you report to police? He said, well, what will they do? So we all have to understand that it's not that we expect the police to drive out to his neighborhood and do something after the fact, but that people realize what's happening and the scope of it so that the police officers take, and everyone else in public policy takes more notice of what's going on.
Yeah, and another thing I'll add is that oftentimes, and not always, but there is a pattern of escalation in terms of incidents. Oftentimes, synagogues, institutions that are vandalized with anti-Semitic flyers or anti-Semitic graffiti will eventually experience bomb threats of their own, or may in and of itself experience other threats to their respective community. And so it really starts oftentimes by picking up the small cues and you know choosing to operate under the belief that no community should be waking up to anti-Semitic flyers on their lawn. It's just intolerable, and we should make sure that all of these incidents see the light of day.
Evelyn, what do you want to ask as we come to close to the end of our talk?
Um, what were significant measures against anti-Semitism that were taken in 2023 when you analyzed the policies?
That's a good one. I think the most powerful ones that I've seen came out of the UK and Germany, um, where I have no expectation that they be replicated in the United States because again, we're dealing with a different political reality. But the criminalization of um, holding up Hamas flags in quote unquote pro-Palestinian marches, the open support of Hamas or other Palestinian terror groups,
Where was that?
um,
Where was that?
the criminalization of this
Yeah.
in Germany and the UK.
Okay.
Um, And I believe I never followed up with the legislative process, but I believe there were efforts to deport individuals who openly espoused these views that were, of course, non-citizens of the respective country. Um, those are effective tools, and the West really has to grapple with itself and find a new sense of identity here because we've treasured individual freedoms and liberties for so long, um, that I don't think we've truly wrestled with the question of whether absolute individual freedoms can come at the expense of the collective at some point. And again, it came from a conversation I heard from Elon Levy and Douglas Murray, where Douglas talks about the fact that over time, what we're seeing is more authoritarian states speak less and less about human rights abuses, therefore giving the impression that they're actually more tolerable and respectful of human rights, whereas the West is continually criticizing not only others but itself in almost a self-flagellating way, and therefore it gives the impression that it becomes less tolerable of the need to respect human rights. And so we're at this critical point, I think, of self-reflection that needs to come. And whether you were Jewish, whether you weren't Jewish, whether you were conservative, whether you were liberal, most people who have a fine-tuned moral compass were troubled by anti-Israel marches that they saw in their respective and beloved cities, because these marches were not calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state. They were not calling for Hamas to step down and hand
Release
over
the hostage.
power to a more moderate, liberal Palestinian political faction, not that it exists, um, in order to push forward a peace process. They didn't call for the release of the hostages. They were either chanting in favor of the Houthis, the terror group operating as a proxy for Iran in Yemen, or they were saying that resistance, referring to the incidents of October 7th, including mass rape, burning, slaughter, were legitimate forms of resistance. And so any individual who has a fine-tuned moral compass would be appalled to see tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, endorsing these values.
So do you have any recommendation, and first, do you have any last words and any recommendation for our listeners of, besides reporting these incidents on social media so your new technology will pick it up, how they individually can combat anti-Semitism around the globe?
That's the $1 million question.
Well, I don't want to give the answer for you, but you said something very important at the beginning, which is first they have to recognize anti-Semitism. And I think
True.
many Jews, I can only speak in the United States, culturally don't want to recognize it because it's really upsetting to recognize. So it's easier to pretend it wasn't anti-Semitic. So basically what you said very early in this talk is we have to recognize it in order to report it, in order to do something.
Absolutely. Education is a key component of this, but education is nothing without the inherent desire or motivation to act upon knowledge. Okay. If we're engaging in the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of pursuing the sake of knowledge, that's going to have little impact on the fate of our community. But if we want to do something powerful with that knowledge, that changes the name of the game. And I'll speak to my fellow community now, fellow community members. I have been doing Israel activism and fighting anti-Semitism for over a decade. It's a key component of my identity. And I would be lying if I said that since October 7th, particularly, there's days where I get up and I say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. I mean, I see no light at the end of the tunnel. The hatred seems to be getting worse. Um, and every day there's a new allegation. And even though that allegation is corrected 2 weeks from now, between now and then, everyone assumes it as a God-given reality, but it's not. And so it can be very tiring and very frustrated. And so what I want to say to my fellow community members is that if we don't do this for ourselves, no one will do it for us. Um, and if how the United Nations has reacted, if how policymakers around the world who claimed post October 7th to have Israel's back no matter what it chose to do in terms of dismantling Hamas, and who had backtracked on their word months ago. I think it's evidence that we are alone, but these are the moments, these are exactly the moments in which we understand why an Israel is so necessary and why a Jewish Israel is so necessary. And what keeps me going in particular during those difficult days is the knowledge that if I put my, if I put my guns down, no one is going to raise them up for me. And whether I stay here or not, whether I'm erased, whether I'm, you know, removed is going to be inconsequential to most of our neighbors who claim to be there in support of us, but who have very little patience and very little understanding for what actually needs to be done in order to guarantee Israel's safety. And so, despite the lows and despite the difficult moments and days that we may have, continue to fight and continue to find meaning in every single thing that you do. Because again, if we don't do this for ourselves, no one will do it for us.
Well said. Thank you so much, Yoni, really, for your insight. We thank our listeners. For those of you who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself and our anti-Semitism and Holocaust education work, go to Never Again Is Now podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And as we end every episode, although recently I am also adding Bring Them Home about the hostages, we end every episode by saying, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.